Mabuhay, or in Kapampangan, luwid kayo. So the second question I always get asked about Aguinaldo was that if Aguinaldo's presidency was founded on fraud and murder, then why do people see him as a hero? Well, the short answer to this question is that Aguinaldo actually enjoyed good relationships with the colonizers. Aguinaldo was part of the ruling upper class of Cavite under the Spanish colonial rule. Aguinaldo enjoyed the status of being an upper class even throughout the revolution. In fact, many believe that Aguinaldo's true allegiance was not to the freedom of the Filipino people, but more on to maintain his status as a ruler, as an upper class elite. So by December of 1897, Aguinaldo made a truce with the Spaniards. While the revolution was still going on and the Filipino people still want to fight for their freedom, Aguinaldo practically surrendered to the Spaniards. He signed an agreement to go into exile. So what people often forget about this agreement was that Aguinaldo and his men were paid to go into exile. Aguinaldo willingly agreed to leave the Filipino Revolution, to leave the fight for Filipino freedom behind in exchange for 800,000 Mexican pesos, which in today's money is worth more than $12 million. Aguinaldo and his men willingly left the Philippines and lived in comfortable exile, while the Filipino people back in the motherland were still fighting for their freedom, were still dying for the revolution. And when the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Aguinaldo blindly negotiated with the Americans. He blindly and willingly made compromising agreements with the Americans, with the United States, despite not even being able to speak in English, despite having terrible Spanish. Now, I don't have anything against Filipinos who cannot speak English, but it's just interesting for me to see Aguinaldo insulting Bonifacio for being too stupid to be a leader. Yet it was Aguinaldo who compromised the freedom of the Filipino people. It's interesting because Bonifacio actually spoke more languages than Aguinaldo. Bonifacio, on top of his Kapampangan heritage, he also mastered the Tagalog language. He spoke fluent Spanish and was also good in English. So it's just very funny for me to see Aguinaldo insult Bonifacio, yet he was the one who made compromising agreements and compromised the freedom of the Filipino people. But that could be a topic for an entirely different video. So back to Aguinaldo and the Americans. Throughout the Philippine-American War, there has been rumors that Aguinaldo was reluctant in fighting the Americans, that he would rather focus more on the surrender of the Filipino people to the Americans rather than fight the war. In fact, throughout the fighting, Aguinaldo pushed for the negotiations to make the Philippines a protectorate of the United States, to surrender Filipino freedom and sovereignty to the United States. So while thousands and thousands of Filipinos were dying for their freedom, while millions of Filipinos were killed in this war and genocide, Aguinaldo was willingly negotiating surrender to the Americans. In fact, when he was captured by the Americans in 1901, Aguinaldo was not treated as an enemy or as a prisoner. He was treated as a guest of honor at the Malacanang Palace. And this only added to the rumors that Aguinaldo willingly surrendered to the Americans rather than fight for Filipino freedom. He gave up on Filipino independence in exchange for a life of privilege under the Americans. But just like in 1897, when Aguinaldo surrendered to the Spaniards, Aguinaldo's capture by the Americans did not stop the Filipino people for fighting for their independence, for fighting for their freedom. And according to Apolinario Mabini, known as the brains of the revolution, the struggle for Philippine independence and for the freedom of the Filipino people failed, ultimately because of Aguinaldo's bad leadership. So I'm just gonna read a quote from Mabini's own memoir, La Revolucion Filipina, where he talked about while the Filipino Revolution failed. According to Mabini, the revolution failed because it was badly led, because its leader won his position by reprehensible rather than meritorious acts, because instead of supporting men most useful for the people, Aguinaldo made them useless out of jealousy. He judged the worth of men not by their ability, character, or patriotism, but rather by their degree of friendship and kinship with him. Aguinaldo was obsessed with power, and he was more concerned with his status as president rather than focusing his energy in the fight for Philippine independence. He was more vengeful and jealous rather than being patriotic. His ego was more important than the freedom of the Filipino people. So I guess the lesson from this is that when we see leaders like Aguinaldo focus more on their own selfish interests, on their own benefits and privileges, and they focus more on attacking their own rivals and critics rather than serving the people, then that's when we know that they're no longer the leaders nor the heroes to the people they swore an oath to serve. And that is it for me today. If you want to learn more about Aguinaldo and the Americans, I wrote a whole chapter on it in my book. And if you like this video and learned a thing or two, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to help me make more videos like this, show your support and please be my patron or get a copy of my book, The Kalpung Salamat. See you next time, or in Tagalog, kita kits, and in Kapampangan, Mikitix.